Thomas R. Edgar, Professor, New Testament Literature, Capital Bible Seminary. He wrote, "If the miraculous gifts of the church age had continued in the church, one would expect an unbroken line of occurrences from apostolic times to the present. If they are of God, why should such miracles be absent for centuries?" The entire controversy exists because the miraculous gifts of the church age did cease and did not occur for almost 1900 years of church history. Certainly have not continued in an unbroken line. Questions about their presence today, as well as differing opinions, even among charismatics, regarding the nature of tongues, prophecy, and certain other gifts, are due to the fact that they ceased. Chrysostom, a 4th century theologian, testified that they had ceased so long before his time that no one was certain of their characteristics. He writes, "Though some have attempted to prove that tongues and other miraculous gifts have occurred in the post-apostolic history of the church, the very paucity and sporadic nature of alleged occurrences is evidence against this claim. Referring to alleged instances of tongue speaking, Hinson, a church historian, sums up the situation this way. The first 16 centuries of its history were lean ones indeed. In the first 5 centuries, if the first 5 centuries were lean, the next were starvation years for the practicing Western Christendom, and doubtful ones in Eastern Christendom." Frank Stagg writes, "After a few alleged instances in the 2nd century, there is a gap of almost 1,000 years before a few more occur. Obviously, it would not have been difficult to produce evidence for these gifts during the apostolic age. Why, then, is there such a lack of evidence if the gifts continued throughout church history? The alleged instances are even more rare if restricted to genuine believers, and if hearsay evidence is omitted. If instances of the gift of healing, rather than supposed answers to prayer, are considered, the alleged instances all but vanish." A lot of people argue with me about that. Well, you don't believe in healing. I didn't say I didn't believe in healing. I said, right now, for this day and age, I don't believe in the miraculous gift of healing. God heals. He's always healed. He didn't wait for the 1st century to come around and provide people with the miraculous gift of healing. You can pray anytime you want. God will heal according to his sovereignty. In other words, healing in answer to prayer can account for these instances of healing rather than the direct application of the spiritual gift of healing. That these miraculous workings ceased in the past can hardly be refuted, and this is recognized by many charismatics. Dayton feels that many charismatics actually prefer to grant that certain gifts ceased, since they regard today's phenomena as a latter-day pouring out of the Spirit, so they make up their own stuff. I would say, okay, chapter and verse. As soon as we get into the Bible, you see the back of their heels. Point 1. The explanations offered to verify the modern expressions of the sign gifts, I should say gifts, are not biblical. A, the argument that the gifts faded away because of a failure to believe in miracles is unbiblical. Edgar goes on to say, for miraculous signs and wonders to be missing, those at Pentecost were not expecting to speak as they did. In Acts, no tongue speaker was previously aware of the existence of the gift, yet they spoke. They could hardly have had faith in their ability to perform miracles or to speak in tongues, since they were unaware of such gifts. They did not obtain or lose the ability because of their belief or lack of belief in the charismatic. If God gave these gifts during the history of the church, they would have occurred regardless of man's frailty. To argue that the gifts faded away in the post-apostolic church because of a failure to believe in miracles evades the facts of history and has no biblical support. 1 Corinthians chapters 12 to 14 imply that the early church was only too inclined towards such gifts rather than against them. In almost every religion, men have been inclined toward the miraculous rather than toward rejecting obvious miracles. And yet some argue that miracles ceased, or nearly so, in the early church. An error when belief in the supernatural was rampant, and when the signs and wonders actually occurred. Because of this belief in miracles? Yet it is claimed that in the most rationalistic of ages, when no miracles were occurring, 19th and 20th century Christians believed to the extent that the gifts reoccurred and reoccurred on the scale of today's claims. Since modern Christians are so receptive to signs and wonders, and modern man is so willing to believe the charismatic claims, on what basis can one assume that the early Christians would refuse to do so? Those willing to believe religious miracles are always plentiful. To claim that this miraculous infusion of the Spirit gives joy, purpose, power for service, and revitalization of the church, and at the same time claim that such a tremendous working was ignored, rejected, and allowed to drop out of the early church which experienced it, is illogical. B. The argument that an alternative use for the gift of tongues is a solely self-edifying prayer language, even a language of angels that takes over as an expression by the Holy Spirit in the believer, is unbiblical. Some people say they have that gift of tongues so that the devil can't figure out what you're saying. They think they're smarter than the devil. 1 Corinthians 13:1. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. The word if in the statement of hyperbole, and the hyperbole itself is totally ignored. It's if. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. Paul has indicated, especially evident in the Greek, that he does not speak in all of the kinds of tongues of men, nor of all the language of angels. But if he did, and he says he does not, it would be worthless if done without the greatest expression of all. Love, agape, self-sacrificial, godly love. Now, Paul can be said to speak in all of the languages of all men, and even the language of angels as a result of this verse. Then he must have burned himself to death as a result of verse 3, which is said in the same context. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. Clearly, this is hyperbole. For there is no record of Paul committing suicide by burning himself to death, nor of speaking in the language of angels, nor of all of the languages of the earth. And then we have Romans 8:26, which tongues advocates today claim as supporting their use of tongues as a prayer language. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weaknesses. We don't know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groans that words cannot express. So the Holy Spirit groans, but he's not expressing. That's somewhat of a hyperbole. Does the Holy Spirit need a voice? And he who searches our hearts, God the Father, who answers our prayers, knows the mind of the Spirit, who intercedes on behalf of the saints' prayers, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints in accordance with God's will. So the Holy Spirit reconstitutes the saints' prayers so that they are in accordance with God's will, yet coinciding with the hearts of the saints who are praying, but not always knowing precisely what to pray when they do pray. So God the Holy Spirit is simply hearing the prayers of the saints, which are imperfect relative to the will of God, the situation, and so on, and reconstitutes them so that the situation and requests align totally with the will of God. Say with. And can be answered to best suit the needs of the situation within God's will.
Take care of you. I think you'd be just the man to try it. But first, let's consider the motive of whoever it was killed Danvers. He was one of the birds I was after. Danvers had to blow town. He tried to grab the hidden loot to take it with him, but the other two beat him to the draw. Whoever they are, drop that mail sack. It's a felony for anyone but a postmaster to break the seal on that sack. Well, it looks like you won't be getting your mail today. It looks like it won't even be necessary. Kip, I warn you. It's my duty to shoot any man here who tries to open that sack. Then that puts you in a bad position, Sheriff, because you're the man that's going to open it. Me? I'm thirsty. Get at it. Don't let him get away with this. Braggart, I've been promising myself to draw on you. Don't encourage me. Why should every man try gaugeless mailbacks?
So, the language and context is about the Holy Spirit interceding for the prayers of all believers and reconstituting the prayers into the will of God to best provide for the needs of the saints. Not all believers speak in tongues, prayer language, so this could not be about tongues in the first place. In the second place, the Holy Spirit overtaking the believer's own voice box so that unutterable groans. How do you express an unutterable groan? Groanings inexpressible, unutterable. Can be non-expressed, yet somehow come out as incomprehensible sounds out of the mouth of the individual, would make this verse simply nonsensical, twisting the language beyond its capacity. It's hyperbole. Thirdly, tongues is supposed to be comprehensible, as defined by Paul in 1 Corinthians 14:13-17. Paul admonishes tongues users to be cognitive of what they are saying and not utter mysteries to God. 1 Corinthians 14:13-17. For this reason, anyone who speaks in a tongue should pray that he may interpret what he says. He should interpret it, and others should interpret it also. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. You should know what you're saying. Know what you're praying.